I don't think Britain should have entered the First World War. I think we'd have been better off if we'd stayed out and actually let the Central Powers win. Shocking.
The Times has got a brand new columnist, the historian and rock star podcaster, Dominic Sandbrook. Kicks off with an essay in the Times tomorrow, taking a look at King Charles and how he's getting along. Kate's texted love Dominic Sandbrook, and Dominic Sandbrook joins me now. Morning, Dominic.
Good morning. That's very kind of you, Kate. That's very kind of you. The check is in the post.
And I tell you what, they do love you, Dominic. How does it feel to be a historian pin-up?
See, if my wife heard that, she would just consider that so unbelievably absurd, and quite rightly. So I don't even recognize. I can't even recognize the question, Matt, because that would drive me mad.
It's like a Liz Truss. I don't accept the premise of the question.
Exactly. Thanks for that comparison.
As a result of the huge success of The Rest is History, do you get recognised? Do people know what you look like, or have you just got this huge audience who only know your voice?
It's funny, actually, because there are people who sometimes, when Tom Holland, my co-presenter, and I, when we were in the Sunday Times magazine, for example, and there were people who sort of said, "Oh gosh, that you're not how I thought you would be at all." Generally, they're actually shocked that we're not older than we are, which is not what you really want to hear. You want to think that you sound 25 or 30 or something. I do sometimes, yes, we do. I think both of us get recognized by people. The weird thing is when we get recognized by people who are actually listening to the podcast when they see us. So Tom and I were once on the train going to an event that we were doing, and somebody was literally listening to our podcast on headphones and kind of looked up and saw us and stopped and said, "Oh my God, this is so weird. I'm just listening to you talking about
the space-time continuum that opened up before them."
Exactly. So that is pretty weird. Yeah, it is. I'm definitely not at the stage where I'm kind of going around in dark glasses and a baseball cap like Logan Roy or something.
Have you been surprised by the success of the podcast? Podcasts for so long had been sort of young millennials talking about their problems, or famous people or whatever. Whereas actually, embracing history has just seemed it was taken off not just here but right around the world.
Yeah, massively surprised actually, Matt. So Tom and I started it in 2020 during, I think, the autumn lockdown or thereabouts, and I think we both thought that we would just be sort of screaming into a void, really. I mean, when we talked about doing it, we just thought, well, it would be fun. People have podcasts, and we didn't really listen to podcasts. We didn't know what we were doing. We have it's Goalhanger Productions, which, as a lot of people will know, is Gary Lineker's production company, and they are really brilliant at sort of packaging it and whatnot. But in a weird way, I think maybe the unspun nature of it worked in its favor, because it really is. I mean, it's literally, we do it just like I'm talking to you now. We do it on Zoom or a similar kind of program. We talk to each other for an hour. The editing is quite light touch. And I guess what really surprised us was we both had existing readerships. So Tom from his books, me from my books, and my kind of columns in another newspaper, which I probably won't name. But because of that, we thought, well, our audience will be people, in their 50s, let's say. That will be our core audience. And the thing that really surprised us was that probably about 50% of our audience are under the age of 35. So a lot of youngsters are people in their 20s. And so when we do live events, it's often quite a young crowd, which is not our normal audience at all. And I think that is actually the most sort of heartening aspect of it, because you think, the standard thing is to sort of lament, oh, people don't know, they don't care about history, young people aren't interested, they're just interested in cancelling people from the past. And that actually turns out not to be true at all. Lots of people are passionate about history, or even actually the even funner thing, as it were, is to reach people who weren't passionate about history, but now realize that it's actually packed full of really fascinating stories and great characters and great dramas and all these kinds of things. So that is the satisfying thing, the most satisfying thing, to reach people who previously weren't interested, because we've kind of always had the history buffs, but to turn people into history buffs is the real challenge.
Well, it's really interesting. I suppose that thing, isn't it? If you didn't like history at school, you just put it in the box marked things I'm not interested in, and then you the podcast is a way of hooking into it. Now we need to talk about your new gig. You're joining the Times. I've had a sneak preview of your essay, which is going to be out tomorrow. And you're basically taking a look at the king's first year and putting it into some historical context. And it's just a great reminder, actually, as I discovered, I've just been writing my book looking at political history of basically 250 years. Nothing is new. There's always something that's happening right now where you can find the parallels. So what are the parallels of King Charles III's first year that you think we can draw on?
Well, I think the funny thing is that actually so often the first year sets the tone for what follows. So, when I was kicking around ideas for my first piece for the paper, the Commons editor said, "What about King Charles's first year?" And I sort of thought, well, nothing much has happened in King Charles's first year, and actually, is it a really good? Is there a lot of mileage in this? And then actually, when I thought about it, so to give you one example, Henry VIII, when he becomes king in 1509, very young man, he's not the fat whale of the kind of the later sort of imagery. He's a Renaissance prince. He's loads of languages. Everybody's very excited actually that he is king. And the two things that he does are he gets married, surprise, surprise, to Catherine of Aragon, and he executes his father's two chief advisors, who are two guys called Empson and Dudley, who are very unpopular because they're very good at raising taxes. And so what he actually did was he arrested them, puts them in the Tower. They kind of stew there for months, and then finally they're beheaded. And actually, that's a brilliant preview of the rest of his reign. That's all his reign right there in his first.
Just a lot of chopping people's heads off.
Getting married and executing people. But it's a brilliant preview, actually, of the sort of the cold ruthlessness with which he ruled. And I guess the two things that all monarchs have to do when they want to do when they kick off. The first thing is they want to draw a clean break. They want to say to the public, this is an exciting new era. And even constitutional monarchs have done that. So Edward VII, who had been the great playboy prince in the late Victorian period, when he takes over from Victoria in 1901, he makes a point of having all the palaces redecorated and renovated. Now, Victoria had been, famously kind of in her kind of great mourning period, wearing black, very miserable, spending all the time on the Isle of Wight. He stays in London. He doesn't really leave London very much in his first year. He goes out on the town every night, having dinner, going to parties, all of this kind of thing. He's in his late 50s, but he's a great kind of hedonist. And that is a very public symbol that there's been a changing of the guard and a new age and all that. So that's always part of the repertoire, I think. But then the other important thing that they have to do, a monarch, is they have to, I think it's really important that they signal to the public, I'm not going to make a terrible mess of everything. I'm going to be quite careful and I'm going to be prudent. So although there is the sort of the surface sort of change, underneath there has to be the continuity. And actually the really good example of somebody who manages that really skillfully is Charles II. So Charles II comes back in 1660. And he has, we think of him as, the Merry Monarch, sort of buxom orange cellars, bawdy plays, all this business. But he has the most unbelievably tricky inheritance in his first 12 months, because he has basically been installed through a military coup. Through the former parliamentarian general, George Monk, has marched down from Scotland, recalled Parliament. They've called back Charles from the continent. But there are tons of people in Britain who are very suspicious about Charles coming back. And there are all the wounds of the civil wars are still there and all that stuff. And he manages it brilliantly because he issues a general pardon for all the crimes in the civil wars. He doesn't he doesn't mess around with confiscated lands. He doesn't really punish the former parliamentarians, only the people who signed his father's death warrants, which I think we would say is probably fair enough. So in other words, he's actually remarkably consensual and conciliatory. And I think for any monarch, even a constitutional one, even a 21st century constitutional one, recognizing the limits of your power, what the public and the kind of political class will accept, and what you can get away with and what you can't. Working out what.
And that's that is clearly what Charles III has been doing. Is
right.
Not rocking the boat, not doing very much is is a strategy. That is a choice in of itself.
It is exactly, because that's everyone thought, Matt, that he would be interfering, writing loads of letters, have gaffes and blunders, and the fact that we haven't seen that is a
That's a
political
choice.
point in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I think there are a couple of archetypes that recur in British politics, and one of them is what I would call kind of the mountebank, the showman, the bit of as you said, a bit of razzle dazzle, but also the hint of the charlatan, the con man. So David Lloyd George was a little bit like that. Churchill was a little bit like that, of course. Boris. You could argue Tony Blair was like that to some extent, and the other is the Mr. kind of reassuring, often pipe smoking, the kind of Stanley Baldwin archetype, or Jim Callaghan. And I think Starmer clearly, he fits much more naturally into that. And I think what that kind of person appeals to is often we forget, and it's the single biggest thing that I think the historians or people interested in politics, their biggest mistake is they overestimate how much other people are interested in politics. So writing my books about post-war Britain, it's really striking how at any given moment, most people would have struggled to name many cabinet ministers. They're not actually aware of the great political stories of the day. They're not really interested. They think all politicians are extremely boring and are kind of all the same or just annoying. And that famous clip of the woman, I think she was called Brenda from Bristol, who was horrified when Theresa May called an election. Another election. Oh, no. God, they're so awful. I think she's obviously spoke for a lot of the country who have always been there. And to those people, anti-politics often appeals. So the less ideological you are, the more boring, the more pragmatic, and just like the person down the road, often the more that a lot of the public will like you.
And actually, part of the problem with the Theresa May call in that election was, the gamble was so off-brand for her, and that's what I've asked my questions, basically about Stanley Baldwin. So now we're going to answer some of yours. Someone on the text says, Dominic, what is your greatest counterfactual when you think about something happening that didn't happen, e.g. Hitler winning the Second World War? Do you like counterfactuals in history?
I kind of do and I don't. So I find them really good fun, but I think most of them break down very quickly. Probably the funnest one is what if Britain hadn't entered the First World War? See, quite against the general grain of British historians, I don't think Britain should have entered the First World War. I think we'd have been better off if we'd stayed out and actually let the Central Powers win. Shocking. So that's probably my favourite counterfactual. Most people think I'm completely mad and heretical on that. I think Michael Gove would probably describe me as a Marxist historian because he thinks this is a Marxist view. So yeah, I think that's my favourite one.
That's it. It was interesting. Over the summer, I was in Vienna, and actually my wife and daughter didn't want to come, but I went off and saw the car where Franz Ferdinand was
brilliant.
shot.
Yes, I've seen the car.
It's good,
in the Army Museum.
Yeah, I just thought, would we put, I don't know, the car where someone and his suit where with the bullet hole and all that seemed a bit weird, but it was obviously such a massive moment in history. Actually, talking of which, Matt in Nottingham says, "What's the origin story of the Kaiser's wrong shoes?"
Okay, so the Kaiser. This is a running joke. Actually, I find it really excruciating. Tom Holland, my co-presenter, finds it enormously amusing.
Right.
It's a running joke about the Kaiser. So, of course, the Kaiser was related very closely. He's a cousin, effectively, to the British royal family. So he would come to Britain, and he felt that his family always looked down on him, and that they always sort of despised him for turning up at kind of the Cowes Regatta or whatever it is, in the wrong attire, in the wrong shoes. And Tom Holland, my co-presenter, he himself went to Cowes and once wore the non-U shoes, inappropriate shoes. So we've often discussed if the Kaiser had been made to feel more welcome, if people had not treated him as this irritatingly over-earnest German relative, if people had made him feel comfortable about wearing the wrong shoes, would the First World War not have happened? Right. So it's obviously an absolutely ludicrous conceit.
There we are. That's Matt in Nottingham tells. Huffy in Hove says, does Dominic want to apologise yet for excluding Tony Blair from his list of best UK Prime Ministers?
No, I was obviously, I was totally right. And that is the canonical list. I am the judge. And so that is the list.
I think that was when I really discovered it. That felt like I listened to that during a lockdown. You doing the best Prime Ministers.
So that actually what she's talking about, or he's talking about, I can't remember what's the question. Sorry.
Huffy of Hove. So I mean, your guess is as good as mine.
Who knows? What Huffy is asking about is a bonus episode for our Rest is History Club members, which I heartily recommend to your listeners, in which I chose my top 10. But before that, we did a World Cup of Prime Ministers where people voted.
That's what I remember.
I can't remember. Blair crashed out quite early on, I think. So Clement Attlee won, as he was always going to do, because it was done by a Twitter vote. So obviously Clement Attlee was going to win.
Very good. Leo in Canterbury says, I was reading Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier recently, I'll get you, where he mentions a massive housing shortage and the market is broken, written in the 1930s. Are housing crises nothing new in British history? And are we just uniquely obsessed with home ownership in this country?
We are uniquely obsessed with home ownership, I think. So we're very poor at, and particularly ownership of your own house rather than a flat. So if you've been to Vienna, Matt, you will know that, most European cities you'll have seen, they have these tremendous kind of mansion flats, street after street of them, which London doesn't really do. London becomes quite suburban very quickly. And that's because, the Victorian kind of dream was you'd have your own little kind of cottage in the city with your own back garden and a little front garden and all those kinds of things. Now, I think for a country with our population, that probably wasn't necessarily the best model. And then the funny thing about the 20s and 30s is that's when a gigantic proportion of our housing stock was actually built. So the Baldwin years, the 20s and 30s, are tremendous for British. Yeah, well, if people keep asking the questions, Matt, what can I do?
I know, exactly. All roads lead back to Stanley Baldwin, not Wigan Pier.
They do indeed. So all these, lots of people listening to this show will live in 1920s and 1930s kind of suburban houses. That's where an enormous proportion of the British people live. So there has always been an issue with housing shortages and good housing. But I think we are in a very peculiar and unusual moment where effectively it's never been so generational as it is now. So there are lots of people in the 50s who needed houses, but they weren't necessarily all young people. The issue that we have now is that young people can't afford to get on the ladder, and that hasn't really got an obvious precedent.
Very good. Des in Newcastle upon Tyne says, I loved Dominic's 5 books on Britain between 1956 and 1982. The last one, Who Dares Wins, was my reading during the first lockdown 3 years ago. Is there going to be the promised 6th volume, which takes the story from 1982 to the end of the miners' strike?
Yes, there is. Des, once again, checking the post. I was only talking to somebody about that last week. I have a little bit of it written. It won't be for a few years, but yeah, it will. So it will kick off right after the end of the Falklands War. So, Mrs. Thatcher kind of triumphant, well ahead in the polls. You've obviously got the 1983 election, which you'll know all about with your kind of political hat on, Matt. So Michael Foot's Labour Party getting a terrible beating, and Mrs. Thatcher's kind of the signs of her hubris, if you like, even at that early stage. I think when you read her colleagues' memoirs and so on, they're already there. And then the great drama of the miners' strike. A really totemic kind of confrontation between Arthur Scargill on the one hand and the Conservative government on the other. So it's a great subject. And I just want to take my time and do it properly, a bit like with Who Dares Wins, because it's very controversial. And I think it would be boring to write a kind of one-sided or partisan book. I want to make sure I get it right.
And is there a point then that you would stop, or is there what do you think is the right length of time between the events and then looking back on them, at the point where they become history rather than sort of contemporary political reporting?
Well, I've always thought it's about 30 or 40 years. So A.J.P. Taylor wrote his book on the interwar years. So one of the first really good books on the interwar years, the 20s and 30s. He published that in, I think, 1965. So it had just kind of receded over the horizon, as it were. I think you have to let it recede over the horizon so that the conflicts and the controversies no longer feel current, so that you can write about them without feeling that you've got a dog in the fight. So for me, I would say up to about 1990 would be, it just feels like such an obvious cutoff point.
Yeah.
The Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall, and obviously the fall of Mrs. Thatcher in November 1990 just feels like the moment. Now, because of course, if I got into the 90s, the rise of Tony Blair and so on, there I would be writing about a period where I had become a young adult and where I was starting to vote. So I first voted in 1997. And at that point, it becomes, I think, much harder for you as a writer to divest yourself of your old convictions and prejudices and things. Because I feel like when historians write about periods that during which they were an adult and they voted and they politically participated, it often just becomes, they don't question their own preconceptions.
They forget that they're just one person in a country. Whereas if you're looking at it with the space time, you look at the country as a whole and the people who make it up. Just finally, Dom, to be honest, I could chat to you all morning. Is there a bit of all the stuff you've done, is there a bit of history you're just not interested in? I don't know, a collection of, I don't know, a particular, whether it's a period or a king or a prime minister or just something. Because you do everything. Well, it's all the way back to the Romans, right up to like the 80s, when you're doing the rest of it. Is there a bit you're just like, I don't care?
There is. There is. I shouldn't say this because people remember it and they will judge me for it. I actually hate archaeology. I find it incredibly boring. So I love, to me, the core of history is the stories of the human beings. And there are different ways of doing that. So you can do that through economics. You can do it in quite a dry way, whatever. But when there are no human beings effectively involved, so when you're doing kind of Stonehenge or something, I actually find that unbelievably boring.
Oh, I look forward to you not writing about that in your New Times column. When you get the email next week, we're thinking maybe you could do, the history through bits of old pots that have been found in the ground.
I'd do it, Matt. I'm a pro.
Exactly. Yeah, we're all jobbing. We're all just here doing a job. Dominic, it's lovely to speak to you. Welcome to the Times.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Great to speak to you. Look forward to having you back. Dominic Sandbrook, thanks for joining us on Times Radio.